Well, there we go. Now it's a little loud. Something which I think really is important on many levels, not least because, as we just saw this last week, where a British king was coronated. I was going to say inaugurated, but that's not right. Coronated. The ways in which we are considering our president has, I would argue, increasingly become more and more monarchical. And perhaps not for the best for the future of democracy. So there's much to discuss as we talk about the evolution of how presidents have become key to our national being and our national sense of well-being. But before we do that, I do want to put a plug in for our events for next year. If you have not yet had the opportunity, please make sure you grab one of the flyers on the way out to pick up our schedule for next year. I gotta tell you, we nailed it this year because we had already, before the announcement for the Pulitzer Prizes went out 2 days ago, we had already signed up both people who won. Yeah, you should be impressed. That was actually pretty good. So thank you. Including both Jeff Coey and Beverly Gage, not coincidentally, our first and last speakers of the entire year. So please mark your calendar down for September 14th to kick things off with Jeff Coey and his fascinating new Pulitzer Prize winning book. And then we continue on. And of course, we're going to be discussing Saddam Hussein and George W. Bush and the invasion of Iraq. We're going to be having our very first, as in inaugural, CPH Book Prize presentation. It's something I'm very excited that we're doing. It's a prize that is given to the very best book in presidential history by a first-time author. So I'm very excited that we're going to be able to initiate that and, of course, keep that going year in and year on out after that. And we're going to be talking about fish. Yes, fish. And nuclear weapons. Not in the same discussion. But that's not why you're here tonight. Tonight, you are here to listen to our guests talk about Mourning the Presidents. And this is a particularly exciting event for me personally because once more we have the opportunity to bring back some of our postdoctoral fellows alumni. We have two of them on the stage today. Lindsay Travinsky, who is a senior fellow still at the Center for Presidential History. She is also the author of The Cabinet, George Washington, and the Creation of an American Institution. The Cabinet, yeah, George Washington, Creation of American Institution. She received her degree at other places that were not SMU, but her time at SMU is really where she learned how to be a historian. There's also Sharon Conrad. Would you mind waving so I know who you are? There you are. Who is an associate professor of history at Tarrant County College. She's also a senior fellow here at the Center for Presidential History. She has degrees from Penn State and Howard University and the University of Texas at Dallas. And she is currently finishing up her book, The Trinity, John Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, and their Civil Rights Legacies in an African American Imagination. That's a very exciting topic, which I'm looking forward to. It has a real Dallas feel to it as well for unfortunate reasons. So we're looking forward to that. Thank you for coming back, driving up the road. Also, we have Camille Davis. I'm going out of order here alphabetically. Camille Davis now, who, of course, is a current postdoctoral fellow. In fact, she is the very first inaugural H. Ross Perot postdoctoral fellow in presidential studies. Very excited about that. She is also a graduate of Southern Methodist University. So we think about that. We get tons and tons and tons, dozens of applications every year for our postdoctoral fellowship. And we looked around and said, the best person's standing right in front of us. So, when people who work with you for years actually want to spend more time working with you, that's a very nice positive endorsement. And then finally, Matthew Costello, who, of course, did not choose to come and be a postdoc. But he is the vice president of the David M. Rubenstein National Center for White House History, and he is a senior historian for the White House Historical Association. He did make the very good choice of going to my alma mater, the University of Wisconsin-Madison, for his initial degree. And then he has published many books, or one book, I should say, many articles, one book, and he is a frequent commentator on current news and on history. And you may have heard that his boss was just confirmed as the new archivist of the United States. So what that means is if you need anything from the White House Historical Association for the next few months, talk to him. So without further ado, we're going to jump right into this program. I'm going to join you guys, and I'm going to turn to you, Lindsay, first, and ask you to tell us the genesis of this book. Where did this book come from? Where did the idea come from, and how did you think about putting it together?
Well, so Matt and I were working together in late 2018 when George H.W. Bush passed away. And we observed, we were in D.C. I'm sure this was all even more familiar to you all because of where you are and the relative proximity. I know Texas is really big, but relative proximity. And we saw the response to Bush's passing and how there was this incredible bipartisan outpouring of grief and remembrances and the testaments to who he was as a person. And while I think that the things that people were saying at the time were true based on people that I've talked to who actually knew him, that he was a kind man, he was a decent man, he had a sense of humor about many things, including himself. He brought a level of stability to the world stage and a decency to the White House. I think those were all true, but they also seemed to also be particularly shaped by the political moment that we were living in that time. And it seemed that people were really shaping their reflections about Bush based on what they felt was lacking about our political climate and our political conversation. And thinking about a time when politics was a little bit kinder, a little bit more decent, maybe a little bit more bipartisan. And so we had this thought of, is this a unique thing? Is this something that has just happened in this one moment? Or, as historians like to say, it doesn't necessarily repeat itself, but it rhymes. So has this sort of phenomenon happened before? Has this concept of what is happening in the moment saying more about where we were as a country and a people maybe than even about the president? Has that happened before? And so we decided to look into it. And one of the great things about a volume like this one is you don't have to spend 10 years becoming an expert on all the different subjects. You get to pull together experts on all of the different subjects and learn from them. And so that's how we set about trying to answer that question of, had this happened before? And a little bit of a spoiler alert, indeed it has.
So, Matthew, let me jump to you then as the other co-editor. What was it that you found most surprising as the essays started to come in, as people started to tell you what their individual president... You wrote a chapter too, we'll get to that. But as an editor, how did you think about the chapters as they were coming in?
Well, there were a few things that I was immediately struck by. One was we had given the contributors a general formula about what these chapters should look like, but we also wanted to give them a little bit of freedom to write the sections as they saw fit. And so obviously the first person perspective matters in some chapters more than others, but I was really struck by how we all approached the idea of legacy differently. Because for some people it was, how have historians written about this particular figure and how has that changed over time? For others, it was about monuments, memorialization, statues, those types of markers of memory and history. For others, it was about looking at specific communities and seeing how that president has evolved and changed and transformed over time. And what I took away from all of this is that we all have very different ideas about who these people were, how they should be remembered. But I believe that that's a good thing. I believe that we should have agreement and disagreement about their achievements, their accomplishments, their failures, their flaws. Because if we all necessarily believed exactly the same thing, well, I mean, to me, that isn't very democratic. I mean, that isn't representative of who we are as a country and our institutions. So seeing that parallel throughout the entire volume, and I think is particularly important in this time where we have so much divisiveness over history, how it's taught, how it's presented. We've disagreed about topics before, but it's important that we can all approach these topics differently, and there is room for consensus.
Well, let's stick with you for a second, because you mentioned an important word from your own chapter, which is statue. Tell us about your subject, what you found. Give the people kind of a few minutes on what they would glean from reading your chapter.
Sure. So my chapter was on Theodore Roosevelt. And around the time that we were writing the chapter, there was a lot in the news about the city of New York removing the statue, the equestrian statue of Theodore Roosevelt outside the Natural History Museum. Now, obviously, there were supporters of that. There were detractors of that. The museum itself had even released an exhibit trying to add more context to the statue. Why it was created, why is Roosevelt depicted on this statue beside what appears to be a Native American man and an African man. And so you have this broad discourse about what should be there, how should it be presented, should the statue stay, should it go? And then ultimately in 2020, with the protests and the demonstrations across the country, the move is made to remove the statue. Interestingly enough, who steps in and now has the statue on a long-term loan is the Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library, which is going out in North Dakota. And so what I wanted to do was connect that story with it turns out, over time, there were a number of different Theodore Roosevelt historical sites that were created. And I say that because when Roosevelt dies in 1919, there really aren't designated historic sites to celebrate Roosevelt or his legacy or his accomplishments. Edith Roosevelt will live at Sagamore Hill, their home, for about another 30 years. She lives until 1948. So besides strangers just sort of approaching the house, people aren't really going to Sagamore Hill as a historic site. His childhood home in Manhattan, if you've ever been there before, that is a reconstruction of his childhood home because the original home was demolished. The home where he took the oath of office, the Wilcox home, that remained in private hands. So there really wasn't a true historic site where people could learn about Roosevelt. And in steps all these different wealthy and affluent individuals and organizations who raise the money, who use their political connections to not only build a recreation of a birthplace, but also to add monuments. They add a park in Oyster Bay. There is a talk for a while to put Roosevelt on the National Mall by the tidal basin. Ultimately, he loses out to Thomas Jefferson. And who plays a role in that? Well, it's Franklin Roosevelt who plays a role in that. Franklin is a big Thomas Jefferson fan. And as much as he loves the Roosevelt name, it's the wrong branch, right? We don't need the Oyster Bay Roosevelts. We want the Hyde Park Roosevelts. And also it begs this question about, Roosevelt died in 1919, and they're talking about this. This is right around the same time that Monticello becomes part of the Jefferson Foundation. They're coming up on, it's the bicentennial of Jefferson's birth. And so there's this back and forth about, is it too soon to memorialize someone who is so recent a president? And then, of course, probably the most iconic one, the one that most people are familiar with, is Mount Rushmore, which has a very different history in and of itself. As it turns out, the further away you get from Washington, D.C., it is easier to get those types of things accomplished. But even that, it connects to the story about Roosevelt and the depiction of him and the African man and the Native American man, because that lawsuit was settled by the Supreme Court between the Sioux Nation and the United States government, and they still haven't ceded control of the territory. It's still under the care of the National Park Service, which is another thing that is connected to Roosevelt. So what you see time and time again is that these monuments and these memorials, some of them are constructed, some of them are carved and built right in the landscape that Roosevelt helped save with the power of the presidential pen. But you also have to think about the people who were part of that process, the people who were on those lands who were displaced. And then you also have to think about the efforts that went into this to try to make Roosevelt really a national figure in Washington, D.C. that ultimately failed. I think that tells us something about the idea of Americans being uncomfortable with memorializing someone like that so soon after their passing.
Camille, tell us your story.
You want to know how I came to Zachary Taylor?
Yeah. Not a president necessarily that leaps to mind when one considers, I think he's probably in that middle range where we say, oh, yes, that was something that happened in the 19th century, right?
Okay. Well, how I came to Zachary Taylor was I was actually doing research on a painting of George Washington. And I do intellectual and visual history. And I was at the DMA looking at this portrait of Washington called the Patrie Patur, which is a portrait that means father of the country. And my dissertation is very Washington heavy because he is the one that kind of constructs our understanding of American leadership. And I kept wondering, why is this particular portrait of Washington created in 1850? It was a large portrait. It was created by an 80-year-old artist. And I thought, who would have commissioned a portrait of Washington in 1850? There's so much work that's going into this. Who would want this? And so as I read and dug around, I figured out that it was a nostalgia portrait. It was a portrait that people sought after because they were at a loss about what to do regarding the lack of leadership in 1850 during the time of the sectional crisis. And I thought, well, who is it that they're all ignoring? Who's the president that they kind of are blowing off in favor of portraits of Washington? And I found out it was Zachary Taylor. And Zachary Taylor had just passed after being in office for only 16 months. And I said, well, I got to dig into this. I got to find out, how did he get to the presidency? How did people react once he passed away? And how did that lead to this iconic imagery of the founding instead of imagery that memorialized the president who had just passed away?
So, almost a century ahead. Tell us about your chapter.
Well, going from a president that perhaps many people don't know much about his death, my chapter deals with President John Kennedy, and specifically kind of a little-known tradition of remembering Kennedy. So we all, being in Dallas, we all are familiar with the story of John Kennedy's visit to Dallas in November of 1963, and the tragic assassination that happened, just a few miles from here. So that story is very well known. But the story that I explore is one of mourning, but specifically the way that African Americans responded to President Kennedy's death. And one of the things that I start with is just the fact that in 1963, there were pollsters at the University of Chicago who were interested in trying to document how did Americans respond to Kennedy's death. And this is largely as a result of a lack of polling done after Franklin Roosevelt's death. And so the polling data indicates that, people mourned and learned about it in all different kinds of ways, but that African Americans clearly told pollsters that their experience and their responses were far more intense, and their intensity exhibited itself in feeling sick, not being able to work, not being able to and many of them actually even responded that they felt as though, his death had direct implications for their own lives. And so this connected with my own personal story growing up, and this is a story that many African Americans have, of growing up in the 70s and 80s, of remembering portraits of John Kennedy in their homes. I grew up, my godmother had a portrait of John Kennedy in her home, alongside portraits of Jesus and Martin Luther King. And I always remembered, of course I understand Jesus, of course, why he's there. And Dr. King, of course, that made perfect sense to me. But I was always puzzled by why John Kennedy made the wall. And so my research into that took off when I moved to Dallas, and I worked for a number of years at the Sixth Floor Museum at Dealey Plaza. And one of the first things I did, I asked the oral historian, so, do any of the Black people that come in and talk to you about, their memories of President Kennedy talk about this tradition? And he says, all the time. And so that kind of sparked my interest in documenting that tradition, that memorialization, why it happened, how broad that tradition was, and importantly, kind of why didn't Lyndon Johnson elicit the same kind of affection that John Kennedy did. And so that's a lot of what I go into in the chapter that I submitted for this book.
So let's talk for a minute about planning for the funerals, about planning the legacy and what the presidents want. Because it strikes me that we actually have 3 out of the 4, I'm going to put you as a Washington person, because you are, 3 out of the 4 people at this table, the deaths of the presidents were very unexpected. Obviously, we know about Kennedy, we know about Taylor. If you're not familiar with the story of Theodore Roosevelt, he had an aneurysm and died, and, let's just say he was a former president who thought he should be president again, who was not in good health and was getting up in years. Sometimes things happen. So what was the planning that went into all of theirs? Because I think one thing which I took away from the book was that the best laid plans of the presidents immediately go awry.
Yeah, I think actually one of the things that the volume speaks to is that only recently have plans really kind of stood. So Washington, when he retired from the presidency, he went home. He immediately started making plans. He was a bit of a hypochondriac, and the men in his family had died fairly young, so he was convinced that he was going to die any day. Even though until like 2 days before he died, he was actually really in pretty good health and pretty hardy and still would go ride on his horse for many hours a day. But he was planning and he was meticulous. So he had a very detailed plan he had his will, of course. He had a detailed plan about how he wanted to be buried, how long he wanted to be set out, because he was very concerned about being buried alive. Who was to be...
It happened more often. Then, okay.
Yeah, he wasn't actually alone in that. Like a lot of people specified, you didn't have modern medicine, so they would specify a certain number of days, and you had a little bit more flexibility in December when he died than if you died, say, in July. So he, who was to be included, who was to receive what as a gift or as a memento, and the minute he died, those plans pretty much started to go out the window, because people nearby, family, friends, militia groups, Freemasons in Alexandria, they all wanted to play a part, and they sort of inserted themselves into this process and demanded basically that they be granted access. And so while it was still relatively modest by the state funerals of today, it was much bigger and had more fanfare than he anticipated. And what I think is important about this story is that once the president dies, what happens next is not really about them. It's about their family, it's about their friends, but it's also about the American people and what they need or what they want. And so in addition to what actually happened at Mount Vernon, there were over 400 mock funerals that were held up and down and across the United States, including one in Philadelphia where Congress kind of had the official funeral. And they had caskets and portraits and often a military sword, and had the sort of full customs so that people could participate in the mourning rituals and pay their respects. Now, we don't usually have 400 funerals today, but I think that the concept that the American people are going to have their say about what they want and what they need holds true.
So let's go in chronological order. What happens next in the planning or lack thereof for a president who dies so suddenly?
Thank you for the question. With my president, with Zachary Taylor, he did not plan he didn't plan to die. he didn't. He didn't have, and
it was not part of his campaign.
Yeah,
platform.
it wasn't.
Yeah.
It was unexpected. He got sick on July 4th, 1850, at a Independence Day celebration, and he got some type of possibly poisoning. He was eating cherries and drinking ice water, and then all of a sudden he becomes ill. And so for 5 days, his doctors are trying to revive him, but it's clear that he has a fatal, I can't think of the word, but it's his intestines is inflamed, and they cannot resuscitate him. And so by the morning of July 9th, they tell the Senate and the Congress, get ready, because in the evening he won't be with us. And so once he passes away, to Lindsay's point, it's out of his hands. It's bigger than the presidency. It speaks more to the American people and the American system. And my reason for saying this is because the country, when he dies, is in the sectional crisis that's going to lead to civil war. And one of the things that both the Whig Party and the Democrat Party are concerned about is whether one side or the other is going to take advantage of this to exasperate the sectional crisis and use it to kind of push through their political agenda. And so when you look at what the House and Senate were saying when they were memorializing him, one of the key features is, oh my goodness, look at how well our system is holding up. In fact, Solomon Downs from Louisiana, he comes out and says this even before the funeral. He says, what's so great about how we're handling this is we are putting our emotions and our political preferences under the authority of the American system. And that's a good thing because foreign nations can see that this experiment that we've created actually does work. And he says it's also good because the American people see that their leaders are putting aside politics at this time to kind of forge ahead and follow what the Constitution says about what we do when a president unexpectedly passes away.
Next on the chronological assessment.
So my guy is a former president, but he is eyeballing a return to the White House. And even though he's only 60 years old and he's lived a pretty hard life, between his various trips, getting seriously ill, in the Amazon. I mean, there's some of these things that he never fully recovers from. The death of his son, Quentin, I think was something that really, and all the stuff that I've read, Quentin reminded him the most of himself. And to lose his son in World War I think, was devastating. He releases a statement to the press saying that him and Edith are proud that their son went out to serve, and but you can tell Roosevelt he's never really the same after that, and that's the previous summer. When he passes away, January 6, 1919, there's an offer by the War Department to give him what would be a state funeral. His family declines per his wishes, even though he did like to be called Colonel Roosevelt. He insisted that people call him Colonel. And they declined the state funeral in that sense. But in some ways, you still see a lot of the same elements. You'll see all these condolences pour in from leaders around the world. Will wire their condolences in. Woodrow Wilson, who's not exactly a fan of Theodore Roosevelt and vice versa, he fortunately is in France. He's attending one of the rounds of negotiations for the Paris Peace Conference, so he asked the vice president to attend on his behalf. So don't have to avoid any kind of embarrassment there. And it's a relatively small service in Oyster Bay. The family has a service first at Sagamore Hill. They take him to Christ Church, and they have the New York policeman on horseback following with the caravan up to Young's Memorial Cemetery. After Roosevelt is buried, there is a national day of mourning about a month later in February, and you see celebrations across the country. San Diego, Salt Lake City, New York, I mean, all these different places, and there's tens of thousands of people gathered in public spaces to hear orators, to hear speakers. But my favorite was there's a group of about 75 suffragettes who show up at the White House, and they decide to burn a Woodrow Wilson effigy because he won't support suffrage. And I joke in the chapter that I think if Roosevelt was alive, that probably would have been his favorite tribute at Wilson's expense. But it's amazing how quickly people forget that Theodore Roosevelt torpedoed his own party, torpedoed his own successor, William Howard Taft, who in all the accounts is depicted as he's like sobbing, he's crying I mean, I don't know if that's actually true, but they make William Howard Taft to be like he's like deeply in mourning that Theodore Roosevelt is gone, and maybe that's true, but I don't know, I would have a little bit of I mean, I don't know if I would cry that hard this man ousted me from the White House and could be standing in my way, in the future if I decided I wanted to run again. And it's fascinating, though, because as soon as he's gone, a lot of Roosevelt's friends, allies, supporters who are Republicans, that progressive legacy just sort of disappears. And what I think is interesting about that is you see with this new project out of North Dakota with the Roosevelt Library, a revival of it. I mean, they're talking about not only Roosevelt and his conservative principles, but also his progressive principles. So that is something that we'll, I think, continue to see evolve and change as that library goes up. But I do find it fascinating, though, that he didn't want a state funeral. I kind of thought that he would.
Well, especially since I've always thought the best description of Roosevelt came from his daughter, Edith. It was Edith, right?
Alice.
Alice. Thank you, Alice. Who said, "My father always wanted to be the bride at every wedding and the corpse at every funeral."
And I think in the baby at every christening, too.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
So here is his moment.
Yeah.
But the Taft thing is actually really quite interesting because they were close before they were not. Yeah. And, I'm of the opinion that Taft never actually really wanted to be president. His wife did. And there's a sense in which, yes, this man had ousted him from the White House, but he ousted him from a place that he never wanted to be in the first place. And the psychology of this is actually really quite fascinating. But the sobbing is really interesting.
Well, there's a lot of evidence that Taft really mourned the loss of that relationship in a way that I think Roosevelt kind of compartmentalized.
I think that's right.
The only thing I would say, because we have so much footage of John Kennedy's funeral ceremony, and we know that Jacqueline Kennedy reached out to, the archivists to get documentation from Abraham Lincoln's funeral as the model for what she would plan for her husband's services. But one of the things that kind of called out for me in my work was just the connection between Lincoln's assassination and Kennedy's assassination, specifically in the minds of African American mourners. Like so many, people made connections between those two deaths, coming almost 100 years apart. But for African Americans, there were letters that poured in. And Ellen Fitzpatrick has a wonderful book called Letters to Jackie, letters that came into the White House to Mrs. Kennedy after the death of her husband. And many of those letters came from African Americans who, in their letters, they make these connections, and they strike such a interesting and tone of connection between those two men, and the way that they align the Lincoln and his being the great emancipator, kind of Lincoln freed us. Your husband did this for us. He was water in dry places, one letter conveyed to Mrs. Kennedy. The connection that African Americans felt to President Kennedy was just very poignant, and it's something that I try to document. Why was there that connection when so many people tend to look back on Kennedy's presidency as being kind of slow to act on civil rights? He didn't do much the first 2 years of his presidency, but in that last year of his life, he did a lot. And yes, it was symbolic, but for many Black observers of what he was able to do in that last year, the symbol was the substance. So many people say that, it was just symbolic, he didn't do enough, it was just all for show. But especially the speech that he made the June before his death, it made such a powerful impression on Black listeners. And just as so many letters came in after the president's death, many letters also came in that June after he made a televised address to the nation calling for civil rights legislation. And so, there's just, there's so many places where African Americans make the connection between the impact of Lincoln's role and John Kennedy's role. And one of the things that I point out in my submission is just that whereas historians, we tend to be very, very critical, well, of,
Everything.
everything, yeah. But, historians criticize Kennedy for being slow to act on civil rights. But, I think that one of the things that I try to do in pouring through the oral histories and the letters and really mining African-American source material is to document that there are different perceptions of these presidents, and it's important for us to kind of acknowledge those. We don't have to necessarily agree, but it is important to acknowledge because I think it helps us to understand what follows.
Well, there's such a sense, and Camille, I think you brought this up very clearly, that the politics at the time are intrinsically involved in the funerals and intrinsically involved in the immediate legacy. And, and as you point out, Lindsay, our last experience with this is H.W. Bush's passing. Most of the discussion of H.W. Bush's funeral, certainly the one in the National Cathedral, was about whether President Trump was sitting too close or too far from the other presidents, and what that meant and what that said. And by the way, sadly, we're likely to have another funeral very soon. It's amazing how, there's a funny joke about Jimmy Carter's death, by the way, or rather at least his going into hospice, because he was a remarkably competitive person, and his staff actually said, after he was announced that he was going into hospice, that just watch, he already has asked the doctor, what's the record for the longest a person's been in hospice? But when he does pass, eventually, presumably, we're going to have the spectacle of having a former president who would like to be president again, sitting next to his
You think he'll be invited?
rival. Do I think he'll be invited? I always presumed he would be, but that's a good question.
I don't know.
Listen, he has other reasons to be in Atlanta these days.
Ooh.
Okay, that was a really deep, funny joke. You may have heard there was a little bit of consternation about his role in the Georgia election 2020. Look it up. Okay. So, with that joke having died, let me offer that we have the opportunity for your questions. We have some microphones, and I believe our postdocs are going to hand out the mics, maybe? Thank you. We have some microphones, and so if you wouldn't mind raising your hand, we'll bring the mic to you, and this is actually really important because that way the audio feed will be saved, and people will, in the future, when they see this online, will be able to hear you, which they wouldn't necessarily be able to pick up otherwise. So, questions. I do see actually two over on this side. The Georgia joke was great. What the hell? Thank you.
Hi, my question is for Matthew Costello about Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt did not lead at all a normal post-presidency. It was incredibly active. He ran for president again in 1912. He basically was Hughes's top surrogate in 1916. Like you said, he was thinking of running again in 1920. He was young enough. He could have been running again in 1924, 1928, 1932. And he's suddenly taken off the scene. And I've always had the impression that there was a lot of relief from certain factions of people that this incredibly turbulent personality who was constantly causing trouble for a great many people and inserting himself in very disruptive ways into American politics had suddenly passed off the scene, and the Republican Party was saved from having a contentious convention about a Roosevelt resurgence. Would you care to describe any, am I correct in my feeling that there's some people who are kind of happy to see him off the scene?
That was a long question. Yes, you are correct. But, that wasn't something that was new for Roosevelt. That was part of Roosevelt's ascent, was sometimes sticking to his principles and sticking it to people who didn't agree with him. And, that was kind of how he ended up in the vice presidency. They were kind of hoping to get him out of New York so things could go back to the way they were. And they said, well, just, we'll make him vice president.
Where he can do the least amount of harm, right?
Exactly. What's he going to do there? He doesn't even get a house. He gets paid considerably less money than the president. There's no housing, so he gets kicked out of the governor's mansion. Roosevelt writes many letters, essentially complaining that, I'm being banished. I'm being banished to the vice presidency. And then as it turns out, fate intervenes and he becomes the 26th president of the United States. So, then all of a sudden there was this fear that this madman is now president. But Roosevelt was also very good at working with party leaders. He was a suave politician when he needed to be. But he also knew how to use the power of public opinion. I mean, that was also something that I think most presidents hadn't really captured like Roosevelt prior to. The ability to really command an audience, get them on your side, convince them that what you believe in or what your policy is right, and then really let them have at it at Congress and their representatives. He was a determined, fearsome leader, and that did trouble some people.
Next question.
So LBJ had a contentious relationship with the Kennedy family, and yet as he's pushing for the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, he very much plays on, we owe this to Kennedy and his legacy. So how legitimate was LBJ's mourning?
And if you could throw into your answer, did LBJ actually kill Kennedy?
Ooh, well, I'm glad you asked. Well, interestingly, so in the polling data that I mentioned earlier, African Americans are far and away the only group that seems to believe that Kennedy was killed by a white supremacist. So in this, I think, forms a big part of why the African Americans mourned his death so intensely and for so long, because there's a sense that, and they say this in the letters and the telegrams that pour in, that he died for us. And so there is this sense that, and some of them do believe that LBJ was somehow involved. He seemed to have the most to gain, and so, but to answer your question about, his mourning, I don't know. I don't know. I can't see into his heart to know how he felt, but he certainly was never one to miss a political opportunity. And he is going to very quickly pivot to using, Kennedy's legislation and his push for civil rights as part of his kind of argument for how we should go forward. When he speaks to a joint session of Congress, he says we need to do this. This is, what President Kennedy worked for so hard and for so long. And in many ways, he makes this. He makes Kennedy a martyr for civil rights. And so one of the things that I believe is that part of the reason why Kennedy is revered for civil rights by African Americans is because LBJ largely cedes that ground to Kennedy. This is President Kennedy's, legislation. Let's pass it in his honor. He worked for this. He worked very hard for it. And so that's not the only reason, but I do think that because Johnson saw it as a part of, and framed it as part of Kennedy's legacy, which was just politically astute, in many ways it's going to contribute to him not receiving the credit for truly, wanting to have it done. And many African Americans say that he only did it because Kennedy wanted it. He didn't do it for his own interest or his own kind of understanding of civil rights and the need for that legislation, which I don't think is fair. But nonetheless, that's how it was read at the time.
But I do think you could say that Kennedy's greatest legislative achievement was dying. Because we don't get the great civil rights legislation without, I don't think he would have pushed for it, and I don't think Johnson or any other president would have been able to get it without the martyr aspect of guilting the other party. So it really is a remarkable way in which our history turns on this tragedy.
Absolutely, and I don't think that it probably would have made it through as strong a piece of legislation had Kennedy lived, as it did as a result of, his martyrdom.
Right in the middle, actually, just to make it incredibly inconvenient for our postdoc.
Hi, sorry, that was terribly inconvenient of me.
Oh, it was a bad joke.
Sometimes when I'm explaining things about presidents to my students, I have to tell them that there is often a difference between presidents acting as the office of the presidency and as who they are as a person. And so is there a point, or is there sort of a shift that we see? Like, Lindsay, you were talking about how people described H.W. Bush as being a nice person, right? Being kind and that sort of stuff. Do we see a sort of shift over time in talking about presidents as we mourn them and remember them as being, I guess, good at their job or their legislative legacy versus who they are as people?
So I think that we've always had sort of a troubled relationship with this concept as a republic because we have struggled to define what the president should be from the very beginning, and that's because we've struggled to define it in opposition to other things. And so from the very beginning, we were saying, okay, but it's not a king, it's not a monarch, but it's not something else. And so we have to try and figure out what that is. And in the early republic, they settled on a concept of what's called Republican virtue, and this is little r, Republican virtue. And in order to have a virtuous Republican president, that means that the character is inherently involved in the person in the office. And there has to be a certain amount of trust that goes into that person for them not to abuse the office. If you look at Article 2 and everything that's written down about the president, it's really quite short. There's very little written down about what a president can and cannot do. And partly that's because the delegates at the Constitutional Convention were pretty tired by the end of the summer and kind of were done with it. And they had the very good fortune that they could rely, and they were pretty explicit about relying on Washington to fill out the fuzzy bits, and they trusted him to make good choices that would hopefully guide the people that come after them. But as we've seen in our current political climate, much of the presidency is shaped, and the contours of the office are shaped on norms and customs. They're not backed up by a military or by the rule of law necessarily. It's what we expect them to do. And in order to expect them to do that, we have to have an expectation about what is and is not appropriate behavior. And that's complicated. It's a little bit easier when you are in a parliamentary system like Great Britain and they have a head of state, a king or a queen, that is supposed to sort of be the well-behaved one. And then if the prime minister decides to do naughty things, then it's a little bit easier to accept that. So I think that is something that we have struggled with, and we see that in the mourning practices because people constantly want to say, well, this was a decent and virtuous president, even if they weren't. And I think that is something we continue to grapple with, is we want our presidents to be good and decent men, even if being a good president doesn't necessarily require being a good and decent person in private. You kind of have to fake it publicly, but I'm not sure it's necessarily required in private, and yet we really want it.
But you raise a very interesting methodological problem for historians dealing with this particular topic, because by and large, people are polite at funerals, especially when talking about the person who's just passed. So, if you read someone's the declarations, those 400 declarations from Washington, Washington's a bad example because people actually liked him, but Nixon is a good example of the opposite. If the only piece of evidence you had as a historian was what was said at Nixon's funeral, you would think he was Jesus and Gandhi and Einstein and Machiavelli. I don't think he was necessarily any of those things. So how did you find, as historians, how did you pull yourself back from what was actually said within the primary documents to understand what was really being meant? Go ahead.
Well, with my person, I think that he's maybe one of the rare examples of when people really tried to tell the truth about him, because he comes to the presidency because he's the hero of the Mexican-American War. He had never run for political office. He had no interest in policy shaping, but people said at the time he was the 19th century's George Washington. And just as George Washington had won the revolution for us, this man won the Mexican-American War. And the Mexican-American War extended the boundary of the U.S. to the Pacific Ocean, which was a revolutionary goal of Washington. And so this thinking was, just as Washington had been virtuous in being a military hero, Taylor was as well. And so he gets into the presidency, and although he wasn't an effective president, once he dies, people say, well, maybe with more time he would have been an effective president because he was such an effective soldier. He only was in office for 16 months, but he came to office because we believed him to be a good man, a just man, a man who could lead people in battle and make good judgment, good decisions and not make rash judgments. And so I think with Taylor, people knew from the time that he passed that he was not going to have the legacy of being a great president, but they kind of ameliorated that by saying, well, he came to the presidency with all of this cachet that allowed us to trust him and to be gracious about the fact that he did not do everything that he possibly should have done during that 16 months in office.
Good.
The thing I would add is that, especially with modern presidents, people are living longer. So chances are they have a longer post-presidency. So the former presidents themselves are going to play a key role in rehabilitating, reshaping, influencing how we think about them, their presidencies, their character traits. And, this is something that has come up because people have already started asking about Jimmy Carter. And it's sort of, everybody knocks on Jimmy Carter. He was a one-term president. He wasn't successful. He gets, landslide election loss to Reagan. But then everybody then says something like, but he's like such a nice guy. He's such a successful post-presidential career. Do you think Jimmy Carter wants to hear that? I mean, do you think?
Well, he'll be dead.
Well, I mean, he won't hear it then. But
Right.
I mean, do you think that's how he wants people to remember him, as the most successful post-presidency in American history? I don't think so. I think he probably wants to be remembered as a commander-in-chief, just like George H.W. Bush, Ronald Reagan, his peers, even though in many ways Carter rejected the pomp and circumstance of the presidency, even when he was in office, but he was president. And so that'll be, I think, a really interesting dynamic to see play out, because Carter's now lived, I think, the longest post-presidential life in history. And, I think most people have a pretty positive view of him, despite, what you think about his policies or his politics. Mm-hmm.
I think it does raise an interesting question for us about how we distinguish between legacy and history and mourning. As a bit of a civics lesson, I think it's a reminder to us that what happens in the immediate aftermath of a funeral is not history. So you raise that point that, people are usually pretty polite at funerals. And we've all been to one of the funerals where some, people are saying really lovely things, and you're like, it's not exactly the person that I knew, but that's fine. And that's true with presidents too, right? We tend to leave out the bad stuff from the immediate reflections, which is a reminder to us that those immediate reflections are not the full story, and that the history does take a very long time to craft. And it should, because documents have to be declassified, and people have to lose some of the emotional sort of responsiveness to living through the moment. I know personally I'm not equipped to write this sort of analytical, rigorous history of things that we've just lived through, because I'm too close to it and I need a little bit more time. And so we, as a society, I think, need to steel ourselves to say it's okay to mourn, it's okay to reflect and to celebrate, but that is not the history. That is the commemoration. And the history and the legacy is the stuff that evolves over time, and I think rightly should.
Actually, we have a question way in the back, actually two on the far in the back corner.
Yes, I have a question about the families of the presidents, in particularly the first ladies, and how they mourned their husbands and how that may have changed over time.
Yeah, do you have?
Yeah, go backwards. You start.
Well, thank you for the question. I think, with Jacqueline Kennedy, we got to watch her public life play out on television. We had to watch her deal with and grapple with very gracefully, we all agreed, the death of her husband. And we now know, how involved she was in shaping how he was commemorated over the weekend of the funeral. But we also know that Jacqueline Kennedy was probably among the first to try to craft a vision of her husband's presidency and giving interviews. She's going to be the first person to say that her husband loved the musical Camelot, and it's that kind of idea that that it was like this magical time that we'll never get to experience again, because it's happy ever aftering. They called it Camelot, and so she is shaping our memory of her husband almost immediately. And that Camelot idea has been kind of sticky. It's been hard to break that. But as Matt was saying, over time, as we get more information, as documents come out, we begin to question these things. And even the First Lady's interpretation of her time and her husband's time in the White House begins to come under greater scrutiny than it did at the time.
Yeah, so typically the First Ladies outlive the presidents. So they are usually the ones in the aftermath who are dealing with this legacy piece. So whether it's at the presidential libraries, historic sites, I know specifically with Edith Roosevelt being alive for the next 30 years, she is invited and participates in all these different ceremonies for statues and memorials, and she's there for Cornerstone Lane, for the birthplace, and the presence of her matters. Right? I mean, it's in a way, it's almost sort of like she is blessing the project. She's showing her public approval of the project. And so First Ladies play a major role in shaping that legacy piece. And there are other examples, too. Another one that comes to mind is Edith Wilson. After Woodrow Wilson passes away, she continues living in that house, and she really is sort of like the first curator of that house. She lives there, I think, until 1962. I mean, she lives, almost another 40 years. And if you visit there today, you'll see like Woodrow Wilson's bedroom exactly as it was when he passed away. And it was because Edith so meticulously kept care of everything. And so obviously, some First Ladies, I think, really embrace the role and really step into it. And then others, I think they probably step aside and maybe let others do more of that work. But they've really always been a presence in shaping the process.
I don't think that Mrs. Taylor got much of an opportunity to shape Zachary Taylor's legacy because I think the country was moving so rapidly after Taylor died. As soon as he passes away, when Millard, I cannot say this man's name, Millard Fillmore, once the Vice President Millard Fillmore comes in as president, the legislation that Taylor wouldn't deal with, the compromises of 1850, all of those pieces of legislation are bundled together and they're instantaneously passed. And you all know that right after the compromise of 1850, things are just happening so rapidly, the country doesn't really stay stuck on Taylor. And so it's later on that his legacy is kind of revived, but because he could not make any sound policy decisions during this very poignant crisis, there wasn't really an opportunity to have a public that mourned him long enough to make it make sense for her to kind of continue engaging everybody regarding his legacy. And so I would argue that most of the things that were done on his behalf were more internally done rather than her reaching externally to the public and to historians and to archivists and saying, I want you to actively memorialize Taylor.
I think that's actually a fairly common experience in the 19th century. So I think the rise of the presidency as sort of this institution, the rise of the first family as something that we expect to play a very public role, women playing, I think, a more public role in American life in general, have made the first ladies more important in this process in the 20th and 21st century. So Martha Washington was, of course, present, but she had sort of explicitly shared George's wishes, and so they also were kind of set aside. The next couple of presidents, if we go in order of presidents, not necessarily in their death, but in who they were, by this point, both Adams and Jefferson had lost their wives. Dolly Madison did outlive James Madison, but as we sort of move forward, when there were first ladies present, for example, Mary Lincoln, she was really set aside by the cabinet. Now, whether or not that was because she was so emotional that she couldn't really articulate what she wanted, or they found her to be very annoying and so they didn't want to include her in that process, depends on who you ask and what source you look at, to your point about source material, but she was not really included in that process. And so I think that one of the elements as this process has evolved, as the planning has become more meticulous, as the practices and the ceremonies have become more elaborate, so too has the first ladies or the former first ladies' role increased.
Well, I'm thinking also about the most recent again, H.W. Bush. Mrs. Bush was intimately involved in planning his funeral, but of course she passed away before him. So and also with George W. Bush, I don't know about their funeral plans, but we know that the library just across the way was spearheaded, the design of it, by Mrs. Bush. So there is a sense of the First Lady being the first curator, I think is really quite key.
Well, and our chapter on Bush 41 was written by Warren Finch, who was the former director of the Presidential Library for Bush 41. And what he writes is that what ended up happening, because she did die first, is that it was almost like a test run for when he then passed away. So they were able to sort of work through the media, the crowds, what that process would look like, getting the museum ready. And so she ended up having, I think, an even more central role than she would have envisioned because of how
I think she would have preferred not to have that role. Yeah.
Probably not.
But it does remind me of one of my favorite memories of H.W. Bush. I happened to be meeting with him right after he had one of his meetings about planning his funeral. And so I couldn't resist. I said, Mr. President, what's that like? Isn't that weird? I mean, planning your death? And he said, well, we have this meeting every 2 months. You get used to it.
While you're saying that, so one of my favorite, no more spoilers, but one of my favorite parts about that chapter is he had a great sense of humor about this stuff, which I think is phenomenal. And one of the details was what was going to be served for lunch on the train that was going to carry him and his family from Houston to College Station.
From Houston to College Station.
And he was like, I don't care. I'm not going to be eating it. It's up to you guys. Have whatever you want.
Yeah.
I just love that.
Well, just real quickly, to go back to First Ladies, we have a great chapter on Ronald Reagan's passing. And if you all recall, Reagan sort of steps back from public life when he announces his Alzheimer's diagnosis. And Nancy Reagan, she is his primary caretaker, but she also continues to be very active helping raise money for that cause. She's involved with the Reagan Foundation on the board. She's involved with the library. And then over time, and as the chapter details, the president remembers less and less. And it's really up to Nancy Reagan to make sure his wishes are fulfilled as they agreed upon. Mm-hmm. And so then it even gets to the point where, I would feel pretty confident saying Nancy Reagan is the one running the show. I mean,
definitely.
And all of the spectacle and the pomp and circumstance with it. And, she was the mover of all those events and orchestrating all those things.
I believe we have time for one more question. Sir, I saw your hand in the back.
Here's a question that kind of turns the topic from mourning the presidents to how the presidents mourn. I know of at least 3 presidents who suffered the loss of a child while they were president. You know, there was Teddy and Coolidge and Franklin Pierce. There are some theories, thoughts out there that say that these deaths caused the president to suffer so much emotionally that it affected their ability to lead, to inspire, to run their offices. So can you address how the president mourned and how the public mourned the loss of a child to the president while he was there in office?
Can I just interject? I'm going to put a plug in for us. This book obviously is a book which I encourage you to get. It's for sale outside. Our authors will sign as well. This book was in conjunction with the White House Historical Association. We did a book about 6-7 years ago on this very question, about what happens when something happens to a president in their personal life, whether it's mourning, because it's disturbing actually how many presidents, statistically it's unusual, how many presidents wind up losing a family member while they're in office. Sometimes the president gets sick, and sometimes, as we say with Bill Clinton, there are crises of their own making. And in each case, they have a really difficult time of trying to remember that they, of course, have to be strong for the nation when they're crumbling inside. Lincoln, I think, is probably the best example of this. You know, we know that Lincoln would have obviously depressive periods throughout his entire life. He loses his son in the middle of, actually the beginning of the Civil War, but it's very hard for him to portray that to the nation because everyone is losing their son, or rather so many people are. I will tell you that this is actually one of the critiques against Mrs. Lincoln that comes up at the time, because she insisted that the White House hold no social functions for a year in honor of Willie's death. And that was longer than people in Washington wanted to be excluded from partying at the White House. And it was very much her, but not him.
Totally stole my answer. I was going to add Lincoln to the list, and I don't know if you've seen the movie Lincoln, but I think that this is portrayed extraordinarily. Abraham and Mary have a fight, and she is expressing her sorrow, and he basically says, "I can't think about that, because if I think about that, then I can't do my work, and I can't, you can't avoid the Civil War. The Civil War is not going to take care of itself." And I think that is how he handled it, was he just had to compartmentalize. I do think in some ways it actually made him a better president because he was so empathetic, and he did not take lightly what it meant to ask people to lose their sons. So I think it made him better. It's certainly, if you see the pictures of him, we see this with all presidents, the aging process. Lincoln is probably the most severe, partly because of his personal loss and partly because of the Civil War. So that empathy weighed heavily on him.
You mentioned Coolidge. Coolidge's son, I think it's Cal Jr., dies in 1924, and septicemia. He gets a blister on his toe playing tennis, and they don't have antibiotics yet. Those will come out in the next few years. But, it's essentially dies of blood poisoning. It's an infection. And Coolidge writes in his autobiography that, when he went with him the power of the presidency in the White House. And, Coolidge was still slated on the ticket in 1924, and he still runs, but he's never quite the same. And that's why it's pretty surprising. It's even surprising to Grace Coolidge that he decides he's not going to run in 1928. And he doesn't live very long beyond the presidency, even though he's not very old, which to me would suggest that I think this was a really devastating emotional loss for him, something he never really got over.
Well, and I think there's also a way to tie in the first ladies here, because Franklin Pierce is a sad example. If you're not familiar, Franklin Pierce lost his 9-year-old son in a train accident in the time between the election and his inauguration. And what that meant was that he was not just mourning his son, he also was effectively a widower in the White House because his wife was so completely devastated, she never made it down to Washington. She refused to have any part of public life after that. So it really does cascade throughout his presidency. It occurs to me that there's a very difficult opportunity here. We're talking about mourning and death and losing children to segue into a happy ending. But I would encourage you that this book is really, really good. And the people who they brought together, thank you to our editors, who are outstanding and the top scholars in their presidencies. So the book is available out front. I encourage you to grab a copy, come back and get it signed. And then I look forward to seeing you next year. Thank you very much.